Video games can be literature, and it's only a matter of time before everyone realizes it. My name is Zoe Zhang, and I'm here to talk about why I think video games should be part of the English curriculum. What you're watching right now is the first of a three-part series on not only why we should teach video games, but which video games, and how English teachers can begin to implement them, mainly as supplementary material within the curriculum. The series was mainly made for English teachers, those who do play video games and those who don't, as well as for those who are considering teaching video games and for those who are still skeptical. Before I go on, I want you to know that these are all suggestions based on my research as a grad student and also based on my experiences as someone who just likes video games and sees their potential. I am not an English teacher, but I want to get my foot in the door, so to speak. I want us to talk about this because I believe in the power of education, in storytelling, and in the importance of critical thinking, no matter the medium. So let's talk about it. I've also left a link below in the description to my written proposal, where you can get a more in-depth look to my thought process and ongoing research. For the sake of this video, I've tried to break my argument down in 3 ways, looking at video games from the perspective of English teachers, English students, and the future. English teachers. So this part is mainly for the skeptics out there who still feel video games mainly as a pure form of entertainment. And this is understandable, no doubt. Video games are part of the entertainment industry and are therefore made to entertain. But here are a few logical reasons to consider video games. Literature. On one hand, the definition of literature has always been in flux. If you took a look at the history of the literary canon, you would be able to see how much it's changed over the years. The push and pull of what and what not to include. The texts I read in high school were the same texts they read 20 years before me. So from that perspective, it's easy to see the canon as static and resistant to change. But there have always been arguments to include diverse texts from different voices, from women to people of color, and perspectives generally lacking in the history of known literature. There have even been fights to introduce different types of media. In the English Journal, you can find articles dating back to 1953, arguing for the use of film in the English classroom. There have even been many strong and successful arguments to include film and the graphic novel, and many of these arguments can be easily applied to the medium of the video game. On the other hand, not all games are literature, the same way not all books are literature, although this is probably when we should start thinking about what literature even is. With regard to rhetorical studies, I believe any text can be read, but with regard to the English classroom, still more work needs to be done before we can determine which video games are appropriate, which video games are literature. I talk a lot more about that in my next video, which video games should we teach, where I continue to address the general constraints of the English classroom. In general, I think it's safe to say that we wouldn't want to introduce any video game which promotes negative or harmful mindsets, besides badly written ones. This should also be part of the ongoing discussion. Extra Credits has a great video, which talks about the ways we should and shouldn't implement video games, and how even their eventual implementation may require a different kind of teaching system altogether. In general, their YouTube channel does a great job of identifying the current pedagogical climate and applying the idea of video games to a real-world usage. Next, English students. Video games have always been a part of pop culture, but as of 2021, it's very apparent that besides being a billion-dollar industry, video games have a prominent and significant place in students' lives. It's important to note here that I'm not talking about educational video games, nor am I talking about using video games to educate. These are different topics for another time, and include disciplines even beyond English. I'm talking about video games as a literary art. Video games have long been heralded as a legitimate art form outside of the classroom, and slowly but surely, the same is happening inside the classroom as well. If many students are already engaging with all kinds of media in their day-to-day lives, why not equip them with the tools to deepen their engagement, to make it more meaningful? And why not equip teachers with the very same tools? Now, I don't want to ruin video games for people or reappropriate a hobby for classroom use. It's not about changing the way students interact with video games, but layering their and our perception of them. It's about acknowledging the video game as an art form and maybe engaging with one or two within the classroom once in a while. I also don't want to imply that the teacher must include video games for the sake of increased engagement, because a teacher's role, first and foremost, is to educate, not to entertain. But what I do want is for students to realize that video games are more than just games. That, like any other multimedia text, they can be engaged with on a deeper level and thought about critically. Which leads me to my next point. The future. 2 words. Media literacy. These are 2 very loaded words, but for the sake of this video, we'll work with the following definition provided by the Center for Media Literacy. Media literacy is a 21st century approach to education, which provides a framework to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and participate using messages in a variety of forms. Media literacy is about helping students become competent, critical, and literate in all media forms so that they can control the interpretation of what they see, hear, or interact with, rather than letting the interpretation control them. To become media literate is to learn to raise the right questions about what you are watching, reading, listening, or contributing to. In a way, media literacy challenges a resistance to technology, so that instead of saying don't, we're saying be careful with what and how, and continue asking why. For more on the importance and history of media literacy, I highly recommend checking out the Center for Media Literacy and their overview and orientation guide, since it provides a good basis for exploring this teaching approach. We'll talk a little more about how to teach video games in part 3. So on one hand, if we're going to teach video games, we need to teach them with a framework in mind. On the other hand, our society and culture are media saturated, and will become even more so, which is why more and more teachers are beginning to realize that teaching media literacy to our students is necessary for their general success in school, work, and life moving forward. To summarize, English teachers can teach video games, but students need to learn media literacy. In conclusion, English teachers and students need to recognize video games as more than just games. But in order to get us to that point where we talk about video games in the classroom, all of us are required to become media literate so that we can engage with video games in a deeper and more meaningful way. I think that's enough for an introduction, and I hope it's a little clearer why video games deserve their place in the English classroom. But I am realizing more and more that there is a lot more work to be done, and we're just getting started. Click around here for part 2, where we continue to discuss what kind of video games English teachers can begin to consider.